Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So, Tim, on Sunday evening, the legislature finally came to a budget agreement. The details are still flowing out, but one thing we do know is that Newsom didn't get his way on gas tax relief. He wanted to tie relief to vehicle ownership, as well as suspend the gas tax increase. So that's right, folks. You're going to get another gas tax hike beginning July 1st. Now it'll be up to 54 cents. So this inflation relief plan goes something like this. Individuals who make less than $75K will get $350, and joint filers who have a combined income of $150K get $700. And if you have at least one dependent and you're in this bracket, you get an extra $350. So families in this bracket would get a total of $1,050. And then there's a next income level. So single filers who earn up to $125K would get $250 refunds. Households filing jointly who earn up to $250K would get $500. And children or dependents in this household bracket will get $250 in payments. So they'll get a total of $750. But there's actually a third level. High-income individuals who earn up to $250,000 would get a $200 rebate, and joint filers with income of as much as $500,000 would get a $400 rebate. And if they have dependents, they would get an extra $200. So if you're in this bracket, you get a maximum of $600. Now, if you think that's complicated, and it is, there is a nice LA Times story this morning, which is where I got this information. But all total, about 23 million Californians will get the rebate at a cost of $17 billion. So it's pretty complicated, Tim, and Californians are supposed to get this money, not now, but in October via bank account or a debit card. You know, it would have been a lot easier to just give Californians broad-based relief. After all, we have close to $100 billion in budget surplus. And, you know, the state has a terrible record when it came to COVID relief funds, with all these scandals and tens of billions of dollars lost to fraud. I hope we don't get a repetition of that, but I'm holding my breath. So they got some other relief measures. So how about unpacking some of them?
Well, to follow up on the bit about the gas tax not being suspended for July 1st. So on July 1st, in SB 1, which was the infamous $52 billion gas tax increase that was enacted a few years back, one of the provisions in there is that the gasoline excise tax would be adjusted for inflation every year. So this year, that's why it's going up from 51 cents to about 54 cents. But diesel is taxed a little differently than regular gasoline. So if you drive a Mercedes that's powered by diesel, there is going to be a suspension of a portion of the diesel sales tax. So that will lower your price by about 23 cents a gallon, and it would be about a $439 million hit on the budget. And then, of course, you will have this budget. And the reason why we had this kind of roadblock over what and how should we have relief from inflation, rising gas prices, is the adherence to not just legislators, but Newsom too, about all of these green policies and green subsidies. And so there is, of course, a ton of additional green subsidies in this budget proposal. It's almost like you have to eat your peas of green subsidies in order to get your, I don't even know if I would call it cake, of these checks that we'll be getting. And I think you make the right point about, we have a nearly $100 billion surplus and we're getting, 10%? If you think about a surplus, well, that's money that we as taxpayers have technically overpaid to the state. Should we really be grateful that we're getting these crumbs, really? The other issue about, when we're getting it, when are we getting these checks? Conveniently, right before the election. Did it just work out that way that we can't program the systems to get us the rebate until right before November?
Of course it worked out that way. So, Tim, what about the GAN limit? How does the GAN limit factor into this? And will we ever see any of that surplus?
They could technically consider this to be, GAN limit relief. because tax relief, and it's in the eye of the beholder, it is considered part of the GAN limit. Additional education spending can be considered part of the GAN limit. So whatever, certainly additional billions that are going to education in this budget could be considered part of the GAN limit. And what's being spent on infrastructure, that can also be considered part of the GAN limit. So all of that additional spending could be considered part of that. You really could have some budget sleight of hand here to satisfy the requirements of the GAN limit. The big discussion that they haven't had agreement on yet is they don't want to go to this brinksmanship again, Newsom and Democrats in the legislature. They want to put something on the ballot probably in 2024 to repeal or reform or neuter the GAN limit. And that they haven't agreed upon yet, but that's coming, whether it comes this year or next. But that's the big next question on the GAN limit is, what are they going to propose for voters to decide to weaken the GAN limit? So basically, in the future, they can spend as much as they want when they get a surplus like this. Although the big issue with the stock market going down, we're so dependent upon capital gains taxes for our state revenue, we really could be in a huge budget deficit before you know it.
Yeah, and we still have the details to come out. I read that there were funds to help people pay utility bills, help to pay the rent. We don't exactly know those amounts yet, but Tim, you're going to write a blog on it. So Tim will get a lot more detail on the taxpayers' burden.
It's Oprah's favorite things once again. Whatever the details are, it's you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, the state budget version.
So we've got a special guest for this podcast, Professor Matthew Beech of the University of Hull in the UK. He's the director of the Center for British Politics, and also he's affiliated with Cal Berkeley. He's with the Institute of European Studies there. He's a political scientist and historian, and he teaches post-war British political history, government, and the culture wars. So Tim and I, we have a great conversation with Professor Beech about politics across the pond. Listeners know that Prime Minister just recently survived a no confidence vote. So we talked to Professor Beech about the state of conservative politics, what's happening with Brexit, how's the relationship these days between the U.S. and the U.K. Tim, I thought this was a terrific interview, really helped unpack what's happening in the U.K.
All those things that you hear about that are going on in England that you have no idea what it means, like what is the Northern Ireland Protocol that you hear about all the time? He explains what it is and what it means and why it's such a thorny issue. So, all these things that you may hear about on TV or read about in the newspaper, he really gives you an insider's view of what's going on and what he predicts will be the coming future for politics in the UK.
So thanks everyone for listening. And here's Professor Matthew Beech. Dr. Beech, we're so happy to have you on to talk about what Americans are hearing about the current upheaval in UK politics. So let's start with a 30,000-foot view question. PRI recently held its annual Baroness Thatcher Gala in Southern California, and we were so honored back in 1999 when she was a guest speaker at our 20th anniversary gala. So one of your key disciplines is studying the history of British politics and the Conservative Party. So in your view, how has the UK Conservative Party evolved from Margaret Thatcher to Boris Johnson?
Well, Rowena, that's a great question. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that since Margaret Thatcher resigned and stood down as Prime Minister, I think the biggest social change in the Conservative Party is that its parliamentarians, its MPs, they're people who are elected. I think generally they've become much more socially progressive. So in one sense, it's interesting to ask the question, well, in what sense are the Conservative Party meaningfully conservative? I mean, what are they seeking to conserve? So I think Mrs. Thatcher would perhaps be surprised in some sense that the Conservative Party has become very socially progressive. Now, that said, There are still some Conservatives in the Parliamentary Party. Perhaps the most notable is Sir John Hayes, but there are others who are in the Common Sense grouping, the Common Sense faction, as it's called, which he runs, which are more sort of small c, social conservative traditionalists. But I think that would be the first thing, that it's become on moral and social questions very socially progressive, and some of its MPs in one sense would be indistinguishable from, say, Labour Party MPs. That's probably what I'd say.
So Boris Johnson rose to power in the Conservative Party, being a strong advocate for Brexit and promising that he would get the job done in leaving the European Union. Well, it's been several years now since UK voters approved the Brexit referendum. So bring us up to date on how things are going in Britain's efforts to divorce itself from the European Union. In your view, do most voters still see Brexit as a good thing, or has it been a rocky transition? And do you think a fully implemented Brexit will truly restore free markets to all of the UK?
That's a great question there, Tim. I think it has been a rocky transition. I think Britons are still divided over leave versus remain. I think people still see that whole question of Brexit largely as, I was right to vote leave, or we should have remained. And so I think in that sense, the country is still deeply divided. I think it's probably fair to say that in some more recent polls, there seems to be an uptick for some people saying, perhaps we should have stayed. So in other words, a little bit of buyer's remorse. But generally speaking, no. People are still very much divided. There's a real split between people still, between leave and remain. In anything, I would say, if anything, the leavers are more hardline leave. The remainers are definitely more hardline remain. And so I think personally, it was the right thing to do to leave the European Union. We are a meaningfully sovereign country. Our parliament is meaningfully sovereign. And the 650 men and women we elect every parliament can determine law in our country. The European Court of Justice is no longer the final arbiter of law. That is now the UK Supreme Court. And we can determine questions of borders and laws and money. Now, of course, it has been incredibly rocky. And the real issue is, and I'm sure we'll get onto that, is the issue of the Northern Irish Protocol. But in terms of your last point about free markets, I think what leaving the EU does is open up possibilities to have free trade agreements. Now, some of them have been signed, but a number of the big ones haven't. And that is part of the rocky situation we face. The United Kingdom does need to sign 2 or 3 really big trade agreements with the big economic partners, but it's signed a lot of middle-sized deals, and it is trading with the EU. But for a lot of people, actually, to be honest, Tim, economics was not the main reason why they voted leave. Economics was often the strongest card, perhaps, the continuity card for staying in. In other words, it's quite a radical thing to leave economically. It's a more conservative thing to stay in a union that you've been part of for the last 40-odd years. But most people who voted leave did not vote on economics. They voted because they wanted sovereignty of their parliament back. They wanted to determine immigration in their own country, and they didn't want to be subject to a foreign court. So really, they were questions of culture and nationalism.
As you say, Dr. Beech, one of the big complications in Brexit has been the so-called Northern Ireland Protocol. So we Americans may hear the term a lot, but really sure what it means. Recently in the news, the Johnson government announced it would be taking controversial action to resolve disputes involving the protocol. So could you explain to our listeners what the Northern Ireland Protocol is and what the key issues are that leaders are still trying to work out? What do you ultimately believe the resolution will be? And do you think it has the potential to push Northern Ireland toward reunification with the Republic of Ireland?
So when the United Kingdom left, it did make an agreement. It did agree with the European Union about the situation of Northern Ireland. What do I mean by that? Northern Ireland borders the Republic of Ireland on the island of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland is in the European Union. Therefore, part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, borders the European Union. And so for the integrity of the European Union's custom arrangements, the protocol said that whilst Northern Ireland would be like the United Kingdom, as it's part of the United Kingdom, formerly outside of the single market of the EU, EU custom rules would still apply when you get goods coming into Northern Ireland from Great Britain and then going on through into the Republic of Ireland and elsewhere. Now, the Unionists in Northern Ireland weren't happy about this because the Good Friday Agreement, sometimes called the Belfast Agreement, 1998, which formally kind of brought to the close 30 years of what we call the Troubles in the United Kingdom and Ireland, what people might know of as kind of the British Northern Irish or British Irish Civil War, which cost nearly 3,500 lives. The Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, said, look, there can't be any change, east-west or north-south, without both communities, Unionists and Nationalists, agreeing. And so that's been really controversial for the Unionists because they say that the Northern Ireland Protocol does change the relationship of Northern Ireland within the UK because it's kind of within and under the regard of EU custom laws. And the Unionists feel that pushes it closer to the Republic, potentially closer to unification, and it's not great for business. And a lot of businesses in Great Britain who trade with Northern Ireland, they feel that as well. So what's happening? Well, the government under Boris Johnson are proposing to change this, to ditch this protocol. That's highly controversial, the EU say. They say that's breaking an international agreement. They say that's the British government not keeping its word. And the British government are saying, look, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. So as a matter of first principles, nation states have to be able to regard their national interests as a first principle. And so sometimes agreements have to be changed. So the EU are saying this is breaking an international agreement and this is a real shocking thing. But this is not a human rights violation. This is just the British government saying, well, actually, we think we need to look after the integrity of the United Kingdom. So what they're proposing, very simply, a green lane and a red lane. A green lane for trade of goods that are just going to Northern Ireland from Great Britain, from trusted traders to reduce the amount of checks that there are at ports. And a red lane that's goods going from Great Britain through Northern Ireland on into the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the EU. And that'll be a red lane, so there will be checks. And so that is the current government's position. That's the hope and the aspiration to try and mitigate not just the delays, but also the political fallout within Northern Ireland, especially within the Unionist community. This has been given extra urgency by the fact that Sinn Féin, the largest nationalist party, has won a majority in the Northern Irish Assembly, and the Unionists are not agreeing to a speaker, and we've got a bit of gridlock again. So of all of the questions about post-Brexit, this is the thorniest, it's the most delicate, and it really does need to be resolved.
Much of the news in UK politics has been dominated lately by Boris Johnson's political troubles, including being fined for attending a no in-person staff party during COVID, and most recently, maybe more serious than he thought, challenge to his leadership. So for our listeners who haven't been following UK politics as closely as you do, can you bring us up to date with these recent political developments and where Johnson stands today?
Yeah, sure, Tim. I think your question highlights the central problem that not just the Prime Minister, but especially the Prime Minister and senior civil servants inside Downing Street were operating a one rule for us and a one rule for them during the incredibly strict rules during lockdowns during the COVID pandemic, and that has he's been fined, and that has really kind of damaged his reputation. I think Boris Johnson, he's kind of a figure that people either love or hate, like many figures. He's charismatic, and so if you love him, you really think that he's done well for you, done well for the Conservative Party. If you're a Leaver, you think good, he's got Brexit done. But if you're on the other side, you think really he's just someone who just is self-interested and is just blows which way the wind goes. And I think this has damaged him deeply because what it has shown, I guess, is that whilst there's been laws passed and very, to be quite frank, draconian acts during the lockdown, British citizens have never been asked to voluntarily suppress their liberty outside of wartime. This happened during the Second World War. There were identity cards, there were blackouts, there were curfews, we had rationing until 1954. I mean, Britain has, like many countries, Britain has gone through the mill in that sense. But this was very different, and I think this has damaged his credibility, and he's not viewed as believable and trustworthy. So I think whilst it might seem frivolous on one level, okay, he's just gone children, a few parties and leaving parties. It's just the fact that everyone else wasn't seeing relatives in care homes or weren't able to, go and sort of take part in Thanksgiving services or family and friends at funerals, weren't able to be at their grandchildren's birthday parties. This has really cut through. And lots of Conservative supporters are deeply, deeply angry at the Prime Minister. And that then builds on to the next part of your question. That then, I think, has flagged up this whole issue of all of those letters that were sent to Sir Graham Brady, head of the 1922 committee, which is a backbench committee of the Conservative Party, and the sort of the leadership vote. And, so I think Boris Johnson could well be on borrowed time. There was a moment a few months ago before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, where it looked like, when all this was coming forward, all these revelations, when it looked like he was going to be forced out. But enough of the senior Conservative MPs did not submit letters to Sir Graham Brady, which is the mechanism, calling for a leadership challenge. And now this has happened. He, I think, is on potentially borrowed time. He has to turn this around pretty quick. He has to come up with some, very clear policies about what he's doing to try and level up the poorer parts of Britain that have voted Conservative, and as we've just talked about, really make progress on the Northern Irish Protocol, because I think his reputation is quite badly damaged.
So also key to Johnson's rise to power was the Labour Party shooting themselves in the foot by electing Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist who didn't forcefully condemn rising anti-Semitism on the left as party leader. After their 2019 defeat, the Labour Party elected Sir Keir Starmer to replace him as party leader. So in your view, how good a job is he doing in turning around Labour's recent misfortunes? And do you see him as being able to forge a strong coalition to win the next general election?
Well, Rowena, I think he's doing a better job, but I don't think he could do a much worse job than Jeremy Corbyn. Sir Keir Starmer is a former head of the Crown Prosecution Service. So he's a barrister, a QC. So at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, he puts up a much more robust fist of it than Jeremy Corbyn did when he's taking on Boris Johnson. And I think he's organised and he's thorough. And I think he's just trying to say, look, that the Prime Minister's not trustworthy. The Conservative Party have one rule for everyone else and one rule for themselves. But the real problem and so I think he's made some ground on that. There's no two ways. The Labour Party has been, Corbyn, Starmer has been in lead in the opinion polls for a number of months, which is not unsurprising. It's midterm. For a government, and that's never great. But I think he has a real challenge, if I'm being honest, Rowena, because the Labour Party, and he is the leader of the Labour Party, can't rely on many votes, many seats to be won in Scotland, because the Scottish National Party, sort of have wrapped them up. They are the progressive movement in Scotland. And what happened at the last general election in 2019 is an awful lot of, blue collar Labour Party seats in the north of England have gone to Conservative Party because of Boris Johnson and because of the whole getting Brexit done agenda, because they're very Eurosceptic. They're small c social conservatives, they're patriots, and they wanted to leave the EU. They wanted the UK to leave the EU. So the difficult thing for Starmer is, where does the majority come from? So he's having to reach out more to Liberal Democrat inclined voters and Green Party inclined voters. But the more he does that to the more progressive left, the more he steps to the progressive left, the less likely it is for him to win over what we call floating voters in marginal constituencies that might well have voted Tory one election, then Labour the next. So he's kind of constrained by the internal electoral math of the United Kingdom, with Scotland being very SNP, the north of England, a number of them going Conservative last time. So whilst he's making a better fist of it in Westminster at the dispatch box, and whilst Boris Johnson's getting himself in all sorts of mess over, saying one thing and doing another, and having one set of rules for one people during COVID and another set for him and his cronies, it's very, very difficult, I think, for Sir Keir Starmer to actually think, how is he going to erode this 80-odd seat majority of the Conservatives?
So most Americans view the UK in terms of that special relationship that exists between our two countries. Now, Boris Johnson was known to have fairly strong political bond with former President Trump, kind of largely based on their similar political styles. Well, how has the relationship between President Biden and Boris Johnson developed? Do you think that special relationship is still intact, stronger than ever? Or do Johnson and Biden have a somewhat more strained relationship?
I don't really think we know very much about Joe Biden. I don't really think that the the American federal government's presence in the United Kingdom is especially felt, obviously outside of the missions and the embassies and things like that. We don't really see Joe Biden on the TV very much. I'm not sure he gives very many interviews. And so I don't think British people and the British public really have a sense of Joe Biden. Obviously, they know that he's a much older man. They know that he was vice president, two-term vice president under Obama. But that's probably about it. I mean, it's kind of radio silence, I think in terms of the public, what the public think of him, because I don't think we really see or hear very much of him, is the honest truth. In terms of Johnson and the government, Her Majesty's government, whichever party is in power, Her Majesty's government will always go out of its way to make sure that its closest ally continues to be the United States of America, because America is, quite frankly, the vital nation in the free world, not just diplomatically, economically, but militarily. And so it is in British national interest, but it's America and Britain share so many of the same political, cultural, and historic values. So I think Her Majesty's government and this government led by Boris Johnson will always have a default position towards the United States. But we also have to say that throughout our close relationship, there have been times when America's national interests are not the United Kingdom's national interests. Even in times of real close amity, say between Ronnie and Maggie, one thinks of Grenada, or between Blair and Clinton, and one thinks of Blair having to really pressure Clinton into supporting action in Kosovo. So whilst I think there is that ties of family and language and culture and history, and that will continue regardless of who's in the White House and who's in 10 Downing Street. I don't really think we know much about Joe Biden because we don't really hear him speak very much. We don't really see him much. And there are the clips of him that the BBC will play from CNN, but I don't really hear a strong US federal government voice about what's its view about Europe, what's it hoping to do. So I think that probably says something about the administration.
So Dr. Beech, the big news in US politics recently was Republicans winning a heavily Hispanic seat in Texas that hadn't been won by the GOP in about 100 years. By the same token, Boris Johnson won the 2019 election largely by winning historically labor-held seats that had not voted conservative in generations. So given all the scandals and troubles facing Johnson, how do you think things look for him in 2024? Do you think history will repeat itself, or are the Tories in big trouble?
That's a great question, Rowena. I think I don't think they're in big trouble, because the question is for those electors in those north of England working class seats, blue collar seats, the choice is Labour versus Conservative. And I just don't think that for people like that I've just described, I don't think voting for Sir Keir Starmer QC, who is pro-European, would like to take Britain back in the EU, is incredibly socially progressive. Some would say woke. I don't think he is the sort of chap that aligns with their values. Now, the challenge for the government is very, very simple. They've said they'd level up. What is that? They said that public money would flow into these constituencies. Better roads, better bridges, better rail connection, more funding for local hospitals, more funding for public schools. And they've got to put their money where their mouth is. And if they don't, some of those seats will flip. There's no two ways. However, I just think that the majority is so large, 80-odd seats, and Labour are so boxed in, given Scotland, that I can't foresee, even with the controversies of Johnson, even with some of the clear cock-ups during the pandemic that the Conservative government have made, I can't see a Labour government in the next general election if we have it in 2024. I think the Labour Party will do much better. I think the Tory majority will be much, much smaller. But I would say the Tories win. If the Tories do switch leaders, they could well get a bump for that. They could well get a boost, a boon with that. But if they don't and they stick with Johnson, that will turn some off. But it will be a question of who you vote for. It's just a choice of two. It's either the Conservative Party or it's Labour. So I think the Labour Party will do well next, but I don't think they will. It would have to be a historic swing to turn an 80-seat majority into a Labour majority.
So finally, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy issues over a glass of wine. So what beer, wine, adult or otherwise beverage are you enjoying this summer during your time here in the United States?
Yeah, I've got a nice little Zinfandel from Summit Creek, which I like. And whenever I come to the Bay Area, I get together with one of my buddies and we enjoy drinking a beer called Downtown Brown from Lost Coast Brewery up in Eureka. So they would be the two, Tim.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beech. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.